Hi, buddy. Hi, buddy. Okay. All right, where we left off. Hey. President Trump endangers Pence's life, causing the vice president, his family, and staff to... You okay? You committing crimes, buddy? You committing crimes? Causing the vice president, his family, and staff to narrowly miss the rioters as they flee from the mob attacking the Capitol. As the... You're so silly. Can you not destroy my box? You have a box, you know. You have a box, buddy. I need that box. Stand by. Alrighty. As the debate over Arizona's legitimate electors took place on the Senate floor, the vice president's staff could see trouble brewing outside. From inside the vice president's ceremonial office, staffers witnessed the crowds swelling on the east side of the Capitol. Then the rioters broke through the security barriers. Jacob told young staffers that they should stand back from the windows because the vice president's office was not the most popular office on the block right now. The vice president was presiding over the Senate debate on the Arizona objection when the noise from the rioters became audible, and those in the Senate chamber realized the rioters had entered the Capitol. The Secret Service evacuated VP Pence from the Senate floor at 2:12 p.m. 12 minutes later, at 2:24 p.m., the president tweeted that Vice President Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. Hey, buddy. Country. You gonna show the people your butthole? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your decency. By that time, 2:24 p.m., the Secret Service had moved the vice president to his ceremonial office across the hall. But the situation was spiraling out of control, and they wouldn't stay there long. As Sarah Matthews, the deputy White House press secretary, later explained, President Trump's tweet was like pouring gasoline on the fire. All right, give me a second. I have to go get rid of this crimes animal. Okay, Crimes Johnson is in the living room. "30 seconds after President Trump's tweets, rioters who were already inside the Capitol opened the East Rotunda door just down the hall. A mere 30 seconds later, rioters breached the crypt one floor below the vice president." Wish they put the actual times, like the exact times here. They probably got it somewhere. Though the vice president refused the Secret Service's first two attempts to evacuate him from his ceremonial office, the situation quickly became untenable, and the vice president was told that the Secret Service could no longer protect him in this office in the Capitol that was quickly being overrun. Mark Short recalls Tim Geibels, the head of Vice President's Secret Service protective details, saying, "At this point, I can't protect you behind these glass doors, and so I need to move you." This time, the Secret Service was not asking the Vice President to move. They were stating the fact that the VP must be moved. At 2:20 p.m., NSC staff monitoring radio communications reported that the second floor of the Capitol and the door to the Senate chamber have now been breached. At 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service rushed the VP, his family, and his senior staff down a flight of stairs through a series of hallways and tunnels to a secure location. The VP and his team stayed in the same location for the next 4.5 hours. The angry mob had come within 40 feet of the vice president as he was evacuated. President Trump never called to check on VP Pence's safety, so Mark Short called Mark Meadows to tell him they were safe and secure. Short himself became persona non grata with President Trump. The president directed staff to revoke Short's access to the White House after Pence refused to betray his oath to the Constitution. Mark Short never spoke with President Trump again. Wow. After arriving at the secure location, the head of the VP's Secret Service detail wanted to move the VP away from the Capitol, and staff hurried into the waiting vehicles. But the vice president refused to get in the car. As Greg Jacob explained in his testimony to the Select Committee, quote, "The vice president wouldn't get in his car. He was determined that unless there was imminent danger to bodily safety, that he was not going to abandon the Capitol and let the rioters have a victory of having made the vice president flee or made it difficult to restart the process later that day." Michael Pence coming in clutch. It was an unprecedented scene in American history. The President of the United States had riled up a mob that hunted his own vice president. The VP's staff came to believe that the theory pushed and sold to the public that the VP had a role to play in the joint session was a cause of the attack on the Capitol. The reason that the Capitol was assaulted was that the people who were breaching the Capitol believed that the election outcome had not yet been determined, and instead there was some action that was supposed to take place in Washington, D.C. to determine it, Jacob said. I do think the violence was the result of that position being continuously pushed and sold to people who ended up believing that with all their hearts. The people had been told that the vice president had the authority to determine the outcome of the election during the joint session. Of course, that was President Trump's and John Eastman's plan all along, to convince people that the election had been stolen and that VP Pence could take action to change the outcome during the joint session of January 6th. Jacob was writing an email to Eastman when the Capitol was breached. At 2:14 p.m., just before being evacuated, Jacob hurriedly hit send on his email, but not before adding the following: "Thanks to your bullshit, we are now under siege." Eastman quickly replied to Jacob's email and, incredibly, blamed VP Pence and Jacob for the attack. "The siege is because you and your boss did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened," Eastman wrote. Naturally, Jacob was somewhere between aghast and livid. It was ridiculous to blame Vice President Pence for the attack when he simply followed the law. The joint session reconvenes. The Senate reconvened at approximately 8:06 p.m. Congressional leadership and the vice president insisted on finishing the work of the people. "Today was a dark day in the history of the United States Capitol," Pence said, "but thanks to the swift efforts of the U.S. Capitol Police, federal, state, and local law enforcement, the violence was quelled. The Capitol is secured and the people's work continues." The vice president addressed those who wreaked havoc in our Capitol today, saying, "You did not win." Vice President Pence continued, quote, "Violence never wins, freedom wins, and this is still the people's house. And as we reconvene in this chamber, the world will again witness the resilience and strength of our democracy, for even in the wake of unprecedented violence and vandalism at this Capitol, the elected representatives of the people of the United States have assembled again on the very same day to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Let's get back to work," Pence concluded. Despite the violence that had unfolded at the Capitol, Eastman kept agitating for further delay. At 11:44 p.m. on January 6th, Eastman sent yet another email to Greg Jacob. In a shockingly tone-deaf manner, Eastman claimed that the ECA had been violated already by allowing debate beyond 2 hours, so, he argued, Pence should no longer be concerned that what President Trump and Eastman had pressured him to do would also violate it. What? Of course, as Jacob pointed out, the debate couldn't have been completed in 2 hours due to the intervening riot of several hours. Eastman argued that Vice President Pence should adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to allow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here. Eastman described this, a delay in the certification of the vote and the peaceful transfer of power with no legal or historical precedent or support based entirely on specious and unproven allegations of election fraud, following on a violent attack on the seat of American democracy as a relatively minor violation. Vice President Pence later described Eastman's email as rubber room stuff, meaning it was certifiably crazy. Eastman called Hirschman on January 7th to discuss litigation on behalf of the Trump campaign in Georgia. This gave Hirschman another opportunity to lay into Eastman. "Are you out of your effing mind?" Hirschman asked. "I only want to hear 2 words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition," Hirschman said. After some berating, Eastman repeated after Hirschman, "Orderly transition." "Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life," Hirschman said. "Get a great fucking criminal defense lawyer. You're going to need it." Days afterward, Eastman sent an email to Giuliani making a request that tacitly acknowledged just how much trouble he was in. "I've decided that I should be on the pardon list if that is still in the works." Wow. Pence and his team never bowed to President Trump's relentless pressure. They began January 6, 2021 with a prayer. The attack on the U.S. Capitol delayed the peaceful transfer of power. The joint session did not end until early in the morning on the 7th. At 3:50 a.m. that morning, Short texted Pence a passage from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. "I fought the good fight, I finished the race, I kept the faith." Let's see. Donald Trump tweeting, Peter Navarro releases a 36-page report alleging election fraud more than sufficient to swing victory to Trump. Great report by Peter. Statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Big protests in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, be wild. On December 14th, 2020, electors around the country met to cast their Electoral College votes. Their vote ensured former Vice President Joe Biden's victory and cemented Donald Trump's defeat. The people and the states had spoken. Members of Trump's own cabinet knew the election was over. Attorney General William Barr viewed it as the end of the matter. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia concurred. Later that day, Scalia told President Trump directly that he should concede defeat. President Trump had no intention of conceding. As he plotted ways to stay in power, the president summoned a mob for help. At 1:42 a.m. on December 19th, President Trump tweeted, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." The president's tweet galvanized tens of thousands of his supporters around the country. President Trump had been lying to them since Election Day, claiming he won and that the Democrats had stolen victory from him. Now, with a single tweet, the president focused his supporters' anger on the joint session of Congress in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Annika Navaroli, the longest tenured member of Twitter's Trust and Safety Policy team, monitored the reaction to President Trump's "Be Wild" tweet. She told the Select Committee that the president was essentially staking a flag in D.C. for his supporters to come and rally. The tweet created a fire hose of calls to overthrow the U.S. government. President Trump's supporters had a new sense of urgency because they felt as if their commander-in-chief had summoned them. For many extremists and conspiracy theorists, the president's announcement was a call to arms. For the Proud Boys, described in more detail below, and their leader, Henry Enrique Tarrio, President Trump's tweet set in motion a chain of events that led directly to the attack on the U.S. Capitol. In the days that followed, the Proud Boys reorganized their hierarchy, imposed a stricter chain of command, and instructed followers to go incognito on January 6th. The Proud Boys had made their presence known at previous pro-Trump events, including the Stop the Steal rallies, where they brandished their black and yellow apparel and engaged in street brawls. Suddenly, they did not want to stand out from the crowd. They wanted to blend in. They were planning something big. Tarrio allegedly used encrypted messages to plot the January 6th attack. On January 4th, Tarrio told his men that they should storm the Capitol. While the attack was underway, Tarrio claimed credit in a private chat, writing, "We did this." And on the evening of January 6th, Tarrio released a video of a man, presumably Tarrio himself, dressed in an odd costume standing in front of the U.S. Capitol. The eerie production had been recorded prior to the events of that day. Tarrio, who is not in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, titled it Premonition. I don't think I saw that. Hmm. Yeah. That's probably lost to time. The Oath Keepers, a far-right anti-government militia movement, also described in more detail below, began planning for Jan 6th after the president's tweet as well. Stuart Rhodes, the group's leader, had agitated against the U.S. government for years. Immediately following the 2020 election, Rhodes and others schemed to stop the peaceful transfer of power. They stored weapons outside of Washington, D.C., hoping that President Trump would deputize them as his own militia. An Oath Keeper leader, Kelly Meggs, read President Trump's December 19th tweet and commented in a Facebook message, "He called us all to the Capitol and wants us to make it wild. Sir, yes, sir." The Oath Keepers formed two military stacks and marched up the steps of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Meggs led one of them. Members of both the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers have been charged with seditious conspiracy and other serious crimes, including conspiracy to interfere with a federal proceeding. Some, including Stuart Rhodes, have been convicted. U.S. law defines seditious conspiracy as plotting to overthrow or to oppose by force or to use force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. Some of the two groups' members have already admitted that this is what they intended to do. Other extremists and conspiracy theorists mobilized after President Trump's tweet as well. These movements are described in more detail in subsequent sections. 3%er militias, another far-right anti-government movement, shared hashtag Occupy Congress memes and planned for violence at the U.S. Capitol. Nick Fuentes, leader of the white national Groypers, rallied his followers for January 6th. Fuentes bragged afterwards that the Capitol siege was fucking awesome. Users on the Donald.win, a popular website, a website populated by some of President Trump's most ardent fans, openly discussed surrounding and occupying the U.S. Capitol. Adherents of QAnon, a bizarre and dangerous conspiracy cult, believed January 6th would bring the prophesied storm. A violent purge of Democrats and government officials promised by the mysterious online personality known as Q. All this time, I also freaking forgot about Q. QAnon's devotees flocked to Washington, D.C. because of the president's tweet and subsequent rhetoric. They shared a digital banner, Operation Occupy the Capitol, which depicted the U.S. Capitol being torn in two. One especially notorious conspiracy theorist, Alex Jones, repeatedly told his InfoWars viewers that January 6th would be a day of reckoning. Jones is known for his outlandish conspiracy mongering, including his baseless claim that the massacre of school children at Sandy Hook Elementary School was really a false flag operation staged by the U.S. government. Of course, his vicious lie was disproven in court, but Jones is obsessed with deep state conspiracy theories and often propagates them. After the 2020 election, Jones argued that the president should use the power of the government to impose martial law on American citizens. Along with his InfoWars co-hosts, Jones amplified Trump's big lie and relentlessly promoted Trump's wild protest. One of Jones's co-hosts floated the idea of storming right into the Capitol. Jones himself marched to the Capitol January 6th. Jones's influence helped shape the planning for January 6th behind the scenes as well. The Select Committee investigated how event organizers and the White House staff planned President Trump's rally at the Ellipse, a park south of the White House. This event was intended to rile up the president's supporters just prior to the joint session of Congress. A wealthy heiress paid for the event after listening to Jones's InfoWars rant about the importance of President Trump's tweet. She spent $3 million with the goal to get as many people there as possible. It worked. Americans who believed the election was stolen flocked to the nation's capital. By January 5th, Trump's supporters, a large angry crowd ready for instructions, had assembled in Washington. That evening, he could hear his raucous supporters at a rally not far from the White House. The president knew his supporters were angry, and he planned to call on them to march on the U.S. Capitol. He even wanted to join them on the march. It was all part of Trump's plan to intimidate officials and obstruct the joint session of Congress. "We fight like hell," President Trump told the crowd assembled at the Ellipse on January 6th, "and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Some of those in attendance, as well as elsewhere on Washington that day, were already prepared to fight. They had begun preparing 2.5 weeks earlier when President Trump told them it would be wild. All right. I think that'll do it for tonight. See you next time. Good night, y'all.